Well, hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And as always on the Muckrakers, we pledge to shine more lights and less heat on those issues that really matter to you. Well, this time next week, it could be Starmageddon. What can we do to avoid that? I have two brilliant people to help me discuss that. We have all the way from David Bull, as you probably know. He is a deputy leader of Reform, which is glorious, and also joined by Nick Buckley, MBE. A very warm welcome to both of you.
Hello, lovely to see you, Andrew. A delight and a pleasure as always.
It's always good, and nice to see you, Nick, as well. Now, Nick grew up, you probably know this, in a challenging environment, but he overcame personal obstacles to become a successful entrepreneur and community leader. He started it from humble beginnings and transitioned from market trading to a career in public service, where he excelled in roles aimed at reducing crime and antisocial behaviour. Sounds as though you wrote that yourself, Nick. It sounds good.
It does sound like I wrote it.
And Dr. David Bull, who I also know very well, is a television presenter, author and politician who served as Deputy Leader of Reform UK since 2021 and as Co-Deputy Leader alongside Ben Habib, who I had on the show just last week, since 2023. He was a member of the European Parliament for North West England from 2019 to 2020. No finer people to discuss what's going on in the UK at the moment. Let's start off, gentlemen, with the most pressing issue in this election campaign. What do you see that to be, David?
Oh, for us, there is no doubt this is the immigration election. That's what people are saying when I go around the country. And let me tell you, I have been around this country. I don't actually know whether I'm coming or going. But look, we've had 2.5 million people that have come to this country in the last 2 years, and everything comes off that. So people know they can't get their kids into school. They can't actually see a GP. They can't get into hospitals. The roads are terrible. The infrastructure is falling apart. When you look at the number of illegal migrants, this is a fraction of the problem when you compare it to legal migration. And the government says, oh, we've got a plan, we're bringing down legal migration. Are you really? Last year, 685,000 people came to this country. That is the same as a city the size of Manchester. So is it any wonder that everything is falling apart? So it's immigration for us. It's also the economy, of course, the cost of living crisis, that's right up there. The NHS, of course, falling apart. We have terrible waiting lists, as you know, 8 million people on a primary waiting list, 12 million on a secondary waiting list. And of course, we're throwing tons of cash at it, but it's not reaching the floor. I was in Suffolk, actually, last night, and again, crime and policing comes up yet again. We pretty much have decriminalised crime. You can go to Tesco and nick 200 quid's worth of stuff and no one will do anything about it. I mean, totally unacceptable. And one of the other things that I will throw into this is net zero, because the two main parties are worshipping at the altar of net zero. But do you know what? No one can tell me how much it's going to cost. And we believe it's going to cost £3 trillion. No one voted for that. It's on your bill, and people are getting poorer and they are hungrier. And we have seen that, and people really struggling. And they're being told, oh, you've got to replace your boiler. Well, who's paying for that? You know, these are the really pressing issues as I go around the country campaigning.
Okay, brilliant. Nick?
I agree. Immigration is a huge issue, and it's come to the front now because people are willing to talk about it. A couple of years ago, people had these problems 2 years ago, but were too scared to use the word immigration, especially mass immigration. We're over the hill now. People are talking about it all the time. And the second thing for me is the fact that people have realised now nothing works in the country anymore. From schooling to NHS, to potholes, to councils, to government. We've been in managed decline for decades, but the average person on the street now can see it, that nothing works. Nothing works the way it's supposed to do. They can't get appointments. Half of our council staff are still working from home. The whole country is a shambles, and people have realised that now, and people are so angry and so annoyed.
Yeah.
So let's drill down into some of those. I mean, as David says, and as you sort of acknowledge as well, Nick, is that immigration is front and centre of this particular election. How do you think the other political parties are dealing with immigration, and what's your solution instead, David?
I mean, poorly, 0 out of 10, I would give Rishi Sunak at the moment. Look, since he came to power, and remember, Andrew, he says he's got a plan. Since he came to power, we've had 50,000 illegal migrants coming into this country. The cost to this country is £8 million every single day. You do the maths. That is huge amounts of money that we are putting in. Now, obviously, since they brought in the illegal migration bill, now we've got to the stage where people are stuck in this country. They're not being processed. And obviously, there is a cost to the taxpayer. And people around the country are saying, hang on a minute, I'm working really hard. I can't actually afford to pay my mortgage or my rent or whatever. If you come here illegally, you're stuck in a hotel, given 3 hot meals a day, and it feels fundamentally unfair. Look, we believe that we need to declare a national emergency. We turn the boats back. We have given France lots of money, 500 million quid we've given France, and they've done diddly squat with it. So we need to turn the boats back, and we can do that under the UN Convention on the Seas, 1951 and 1982, and I'm sure you know that with your barrister's head on. We can do that. We need offshore processing of people who are true asylum seekers, and we can do that in British overseas territories. And fundamentally, I want to leave the European Court of Human Rights. If we don't believe that we, as a developed nation, cannot actually control our borders or indeed trust our judiciary, then something is deeply wrong. We do not need Europe. We voted to leave the European Union, and we are still hanging on, and the ECHR is one of those remnants, and it needs to go.
Nick?
Yes, I think the core issue here is we don't have any politicians anymore with a backbone. What we have now is we have career politicians who are basically middle managers, and middle managers like to be told what to do. Hence why the vast majority of MPs wanted to remain in the EU, why the vast majority of MPs and the cabinet don't want to leave the Court of Human Rights, European Court of Human Rights, is because that means they're responsible. That means they're going to have to make decisions, and middle managers always prefer to implement what someone else tells them to do. You could stop the boats in a fortnight crossing the channel. In 2 weeks, you could stop that. Mass immigration is happening in our country because of managed decline, but also because nobody wants to take the tough decisions today, because the economy may take a hit. So nobody wants that to happen on their watch. We don't have any statespeople anymore now. People who come into politics and then say, I'm doing this for the right reasons. It may cost me my career, but I don't care. If you don't like what I'm going to do, vote me out. The last person to say anything like that was Jeremy Corbyn, and I never would have voted for the man. But at least he had a different vision for the country and was a conviction politician. And before that, it was Thatcher. Everybody else in between and the politicians now in Parliament are basically just career politicians. What can I do to extend my career? And that's what's killing us.
Yeah.
And can I just add,
go for it, David.
Can I just add into that? That's why I think that the reform is so powerful, because we're not career politicians, as you know, and it's growing from the ground up. And that is what is so exciting. And when you look at the polls, and Andrew, you know this because we're friends, when I stuck there with Richard Tice, we were polling at 2%, right? We're now at 18, 19, 20%. There is something extraordinary happening in this country. And Nick is spot on. People are now saying it is unacceptable that hotels in my neighborhood, in my town, are full of migrants. And I would agree. It is totally unacceptable. We've seen the coffee shops, the high street being boarded up because they don't use those services. People are frightened to go into town centres. It's time we had a grown-up conversation and said, look, this is unacceptable.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, Nick, you raised an interesting point. I mean, you made a very bold statement that you could stop the boat in 2 weeks. There's your soundbite. How would you do it?
Oh, it's easy. The legislation's already there, as David just said. You know, it would take our Border Force, our Royal Navy to get those boats and drag them back to France. I don't see people drowned in the channel, so I'm not talking about anything like that. We would drag them back to France. France would not be happy. There'd be a standoff. They may send gunboats out to stop us, but they're never going to open fire. And let's have it out with the French. If we upset the French, who cares? Do we care? I don't care. So let's have it out with the French, because I don't blame the French. We're giving them £500 million and they're sending us their immigrants. Well done, France. That's what we should be doing. So the French are doing what they're doing for their national sovereignty and for their people. We need to just get a backbone. We used to have a backbone in this country and follow the rule of law and make sure we put our people first. Now we're just globalists. It's like anybody who lands on this soil now think they have a right to be here and stay here and claim benefits. And the answer is, you have no right to be here. And the best you are in this country is a guest. And as a host of this country, we can ask you to leave anytime we like.
I would agree with that. Sorry, I would also say, Andrew, there's something else going on here, which Nick touches on. The French authorities aren't just letting people go across the channel. They're escorting them over the channel. They're getting them to the 12-mile line, and they're like, right, this is the United Kingdom's problems. I've heard reports, and I need to check that this is true, and that is the caveat on that. There are unmarked French vessels that are being used as a taxi service for migrants, formerly boats which were used in the French Coast Guard, which have been basically denuded of any marking, and they are now basically transporting people into our sovereign waters. And Nick is right. We need to say enough is enough. We will control our waters. If necessary, we stick the Royal Navy there. We say to people who are coming across, I'm really sorry, we have to turn you back, and you have to have offshore processing centres.
No, you're absolutely right. And we had Ben Habib on, as I say, just a few days ago, and I gave him the opportunity to clarify his comments to Julia Hartley-Brewer, who I was also with a few days ago, about the let them drown comment. Do you want to come back on that, David?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Ben was caught in the headlights a bit there. And as you know, Julia is a very formidable interviewer. Of course, he didn't mean that. And no one should be put in danger at all. But you also know there are young men. These boats are full of young men. These are not families fleeing war-torn areas. These are economic migrants. They're young men who have the latest sneakers and they have the latest smartphone. They jump in the sea and they throw their phone in the sea and all their ID in the sea. So we are saying, actually, if you do that, we will pick you up gently, put you into a boat and escort you back to where you came.
Yeah, I think I was listening to Sir Keir Starmer this morning on the news talking about what they would do. And he says the focus should be these criminal gangs. I have to totally agree with him on that. But one thing he did say, strangely, is that those who did manage to come over here would be processed in the same way. So the illegal immigrants would be processed in the same way as the legal ones. What's your take on that, Nick?
I mean, it's absolutely bonkers, isn't it? Keir Starmer, if you saw the debate the other night, looked like a rabbit in headlights. He literally had no answer. He kept saying, oh, we're going to process them. And Rishi Sunak, and it's not often I agree with the Prime Minister, but Rishi Sunak was right, saying, well, hang on a minute, what is your plan? And we didn't hear a single plan from Labour. What we now know is Labour will grant amnesty to every single illegal migrant that comes into this country. Now, there will be people around this world watching this programme thinking that is totally unfair, because people who have gone through the legal process, who have applied to come to the United Kingdom, and we welcome people because immigration is the lifeblood of this country, and you've done it the right way, they're being prejudiced against by people who are playing the system, and it's not fair.
Yeah, Nick?
A few things there. First of all, is immigration isn't the lifeblood of this country. We need to stop using these mantras so people then don't call us racist. Immigration isn't the lifeblood. Labour don't have a plan on immigration at all. And the reason why they don't have a plan is because they're pro-mass immigration. They're globalists, and Starmer doesn't want to upset the people on the left of his party because they'll call him a Nazi and a racist and a xenophobe, just like they call everybody else those names. And if we're going to talk, and then, Andrew, you mentioned then the criminal people smugglers. They're not the problem. And we need to stop thinking that they're the problem. They're not the problem. They're business people. We might not like their business, but they're business people. They're delivering a service to people who are willing to pay a lot of money. We could take out a couple of thousand people smugglers tomorrow. They'll all be replaced, just like drug dealers are. So let's put our attention on the pull factor. It isn't the smugglers. That's a smoke screen, so we don't demonise the people who are trying to cross the channel. And let's be honest, they're criminals.
So I just want to,
interested. Yeah, go for
I
it,
just
David.
want to say about the immigration thing. We're an island race, right? A lot of us are immigrants going back hundreds of years. I mean, my family came, I think, from France, Sweden, and all sorts of places. Hence the ridiculous hair colour. But so we are saying that actually what we need to do is to have net zero immigration. If you've got 500,000 people leaving every single year, we say it's acceptable to bring in about 500,000. But actually, it goes back to legal immigration here, because we've got companies companies who can't be bothered to train British workers. And remember, there are 9 million economically inactive people in this country, and many kids and young people. And actually, Reform is doing really well with 18 to 25-year-olds because they are so desperate for change in this country. So why aren't we training our own people? What the companies are doing is importing cheap labour, and that is why we said, right, employer national insurance needs to go up from 13.8% up to 20%. That brings in 20 billion quid. If you think these people are better than British people, you pay a premium.
Yeah, that's some very interesting points. And there's a very good movie, which I often recommend, called I, Capitano, which does give a different perspective about the people being smuggled and how they're basically blackmailed and their families at home are extorted to pay extra money as they don't make these treacherous journeys. So I do think it's a bit of both, isn't it? I think we need to keep looking at the gangs, looking at the other things. When we come back, we're up against a little break at the moment. When we come back, we're going to be discussing how you two are going to solve the NHS. Don't go away. Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined today by Dr. David Bull and also Nick Buckley, MBE, and we're tackling all the key issues to avoid Starmageddon next week. Now, I want to talk about the NHS because thousands of doctors have staged their 11th walkout yesterday in a long-running dispute with the government over pay and working conditions. Obviously, hospital services have been disrupted deliberately just before the UK general election. Let's talk about how the parties are addressing the NHS. Obviously, there's one particular party which has got an expert on these matters, Dr. David Bull. Let's start with you.
Look, Andrew, it's a complete mess, isn't it? It's a shambles. And everyone keeps saying, oh, the NHS is the envy of the world. It's not. We spend a lot of money on the NHS, £176 billion. That's 11.7% of our GDP. It's about the European average, if not more. And yet, when you look at that, our outcomes are terrible. 380,000 people did not start cancer treatment in the allotted time. Now, if you do not start your cancer treatment, you do not do very well, and your prognosis is far worse. When we look at our cancer survival rates, in fact, when everyone says, oh, look, we're doing really well, when you compare it with Europe, we are 20 years behind Europe. So something is going horribly wrong. Now, the money is going in at the top. It is not reaching the patient at the bottom, and it's going out of the side. And I have a big issue with a number of managers, diversity roles, all the nonsense that the NHS has built up over the last few years. Now, in terms of the junior doctors' strike, this is deeply political, isn't it? I mean, the timing is so suspicious. This is their 11th strike, by the way. And the impact to patients is really real. 1.4 million operations and procedures have already been cancelled. And I've spoken to those people who, for example, if you need a new hip, you're in terrible pain, chronic pain, you're told, oh, your operation is whenever, next week. So you look forward to that date. I've been talking to people who've been postponed 2, 3, 4 times. It's not acceptable. And also the junior doctors are asking, and look, I understand what it's like to be a junior doctor because I've been there and it was horrendous. Although I would add, we used to do far more hours than they are currently doing. And that will win me no fans with junior doctors watching this. But we used to do far more than that. But they are asking for a 35% pay uplift. There is no way they are going to get that. Even the Labour Party says we cannot afford to give you a 35% pay uplift. So I've got in my policy, which I wrote, I am saying that actually all frontline health and social care staff will pay 0 basic rate tax for 3 years. That is a significant move. And actually, that's about a 13% pay uplift, but actually doesn't affect the basic budget of the NHS, as you can see. So they would be happy. Also, I want to underwrite tuition fees for junior doctors who are training. So if you stay within the NHS for 10 years, we will underwrite the entirety of your fees. So you've got to understand where this tension comes from, because it's really expensive to become a doctor. And also, when you're there, you're not treated very well. And it's the simple stuff. There's no hot food. There's nowhere to change. There are no on-call rooms and stuff like that, which is really important. And I think you have to have been in the service to understand quite how awful it is.
Nick?
I don't know that much about the NHS because I've never worked in it. So I can only speak as a user of the NHS and someone who has half their family working in the NHS as we speak now. The NHS is a bit like mass immigration. This is the first election I can think of where people are willing to talk about the NHS in a negative light now. We didn't do this a couple of years ago. It was still the holy cow of politics. People are beginning to see through their use of the service that it doesn't work. We're spending millions on diversity managers. We have hospitals painting rainbow foot crossings across roads outside their hospitals. The waste of money. And the people I know who work in the NHS tell me stories all the time. Not only of staff who don't care, and I'm sure they're a small percentage, but staff who don't care. Managers and other staff walking around having to clear up the mistakes of other staff because you can't sack anybody, you can't discipline anybody. The way that nothing works, we can't get appointments. I lost a tooth last year. I'm 56 years old, I think. And last year was the first tooth I've lost as an adult. And the reason why I lost a tooth is because it took me 3 years to get an NHS dentist because I couldn't afford to go private. And when I finally got an NHS dentist, the dentist looked at it and went, all too late now, Nick, has to come out. And I've been paying all my life for this service and I can't use the service. It's disgraceful. What the big answers are, I don't know, but we need change.
Well, one answer which I often advocate is the use of technology and in particular artificial intelligence. And there was a research done in the University of California saying that chatting to ChatGPT was more empathetic and more effective than chatting to your GP if you can get an appointment, because it has more time, it's got more information and everything. What are your views on embracing technology, David?
You are totally biased, Andrew. You and AI, you have an AI obsession. Look, of course it has a role. I'm not sure about the consultation side of it. But look, yes, certainly. I mean, for example, if you have a chest x-ray done, why are we waiting so long for that to be reported? That is the role of AI, because it can scan loads and loads of images, decide, is there anything suspicious, and then hand it over to a clinician. Equally, you could say, why don't we get all of these reported in a country with a different time zone? So it's all done overnight. You then get a response the next day. So the whole thing is absolutely bonkers. When you go to see a GP, and I'll take the practice I go to, you will then be, you go to see the GP, they will then make an appointment for a blood test. You then have to go to the appointment for the blood test. The bloods are then sent off. You then wait a week to hear the result of that blood test. Why? Why are we not doing this much faster? So what I want to create are these diagnosis and treatment centres where you go in, you have your bloods done, you have your chest x-ray, you see a clinician, all done, one go, and our prognosis would improve, and actually the care of people in this country would get better.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I advocate AI so much is not just about helping to cure diseases, and we're hearing great news all the time, but it's also about efficiencies. And if it can introduce efficiencies, whether it's diagnosis or other things, that's got to be good. Do you have a take on it, Nick?
I do. I think if you really want to improve the NHS, we need to look at one thing and one thing only, and that's customer service, because it doesn't exist. Because it's a national service, you have no option. Well, 99% of people have no option but to use the NHS. So therefore, customer service, customer choice doesn't come into it, because what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? We don't care. We get paid anyway. We don't care about giving you a better service, making sure you get what you want. Because as someone who works in the NHS, it's not my problem, mate. How we address that, I don't know. But I would look at how do we bring back customer care, customer choice into this service. That will start improving things.
So there are 2 points. Firstly, in secondary care, that means hospital care. What we are saying is actually, when you look at the NHS hospitals and private hospitals, guess what? Private hospitals are far more efficient. They get through more operations. Of course they do, because time is money. What we are saying is that actually money needs to follow the patient. So the NHS remains free at the point of need. The money follows the patient. So if the NHS cannot see you in an allotted time, then you go privately, which is underwritten by the NHS. What that will do is cause a ballooning of the private sector, and therefore you then have competition built into that, because obviously the private units will want actually to be competing for business. And you, as the patient, can say, well, I want to go to this one because I've heard from Mrs. Miggins that this provides exemplary service. Nick touches on another very important point, which is about primary care. We have a very strange system in this country where GPs are paid on what's called a capitation basis. So you're paid according to the number of patients you have. Now, if you have X number, tens of thousands of young people, you're coining in the cash, but actually your workload is low. If you have tens of thousands of elderly people, then the money is the same, but your workload is much higher than that. So actually, shouldn't we relook at the way that we're paying GPs and actually pay them on outcomes? What are you actually doing? How many patients are you actually seeing? And I think that there is a lot of merit to that.
Okay. The internet is doing meltdown with having both of you on as guests. And so a couple of questions from our brilliant audience. We've got Johnny Dollar and Neil Gardner who make the same point. And they're talking about, do you support mandatory vaccination? Let's start with you, David.
No.
That's fairly clear. Neil?
No, I'll tell you why, Andrew.
Nick?
I know what this question is about. And it's about the COVID vaccine. Back in the height of COVID, the government lied to us. They lied to all healthcare professionals. They told us that when you had an immunization for COVID, it stopped you getting it and it stopped you transmitting it. Both of those were complete lies. So many clinicians were caught out and they said, well, look, if that is the case and if it stops you getting it and it stops you passing it on, is there a moral duty to have it yourself? I've never believed in compulsory vaccination. I think it is a matter of personal choice. But obviously, I'm deeply angry with the way the government behaved and the health authorities behaved. And I think the chief medical officer has a great deal to answer for.
Okay, that's very clear. Nick?
My answer is simple. No, I don't want the government. I want less government in my life, not more. And I definitely don't want governments dictating and enforcing what they want me to do, because that's a slippery road. And if we go down that road, they'll be making us do things we never thought were possible. And COVID taught us that.
Okay, thank you for both the very clear answers on that. I know it's an issue which is really important to our brilliant audience. I want to touch on safety of candidates and those who support them in this election, because it was reported yesterday that Councillor Gary Burchett, who's an election volunteer for the Conservative parliamentary candidate, has been assaulted whilst out canvassing. Apparently he was hit several times by a man and he got black eyes and suspected broken nose. There's also been violent attacks on Nigel Farage and various others. We've seen an unprecedented rise in these sort of attacks. Why do you think that is, David?
I think it's a real travesty, actually. I was saying earlier that our party is built from the ground up, and these people who are standing for Parliament are doing a great civic duty. They are not prepared for what is coming. And I've also had threatening letters. I've had the police to my house to talk about what I do in the event of an emergency. In fact, I was going to tweet. In fact, I did tweet where I was going to be last night. And suddenly I then thought, well, actually, I'm not going to do that because there is an element of risk. Now, what people did to Nigel was totally unacceptable in a democracy. You do not behave like that. But of course, he also has close protection officers with him, and that is the right thing to do. But for ordinary people who are standing in constituencies around the country, cross-party this is, it's not just us, it's cross-party, it's really unacceptable. And the level, I don't know what's happened. I don't know why people feel they can behave in this manner, because I think even if you disagree on policy, you should be able to have a civilized debate and say, look, I don't agree with you. Actually, I was at a hustings last night. I didn't agree necessarily with the Conservative candidate or the Lib Dem or the Labour candidate, but we all left amicably, and that's how politics should be.
No, absolutely. And it's still ringing in the mind, isn't it, about Joe Cox and David Amos and various others and people who stepped away from politics because of fear for themselves and their family. That's got to be wrong, hasn't it, Nick?
Absolutely. And the reason why we've got to this place now is, I'll go back to my first answer. We don't have politicians with backbones. This should be clamped down on. This should be clamped down on several years ago. We allow people to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and it's leading to more and more violence. There was a volunteer, so I'm standing as independent in Oldham, in North Manchester, and there was a 72-year-old volunteer who was delivering leaflets in Oldham, who was chased down the street by three men until he fell over and he's cut all his arms and all his legs. It was all over Twitter. Not one press outlet picked it up. National media didn't pick up. There's a 72-year-old man who was basically assaulted until he was bleeding. Absolutely disgraceful. There's lots of people and lots of parties that I think should never be near power. But do you know what? They have a right to sell their policies and sell their ideas for people to vote for them. We're heading, And the reason why we're getting more violence now is because everything's collapsing, because we're going into dark times and financially struggling times, and everyone's reverting back to tribalism. And what happens when you go into tribalism? One of the steps is violence, because I'm fighting for my tribe. We've only got a couple of years to crack down on this, on all the parties, on all individuals. Otherwise, we're going to have some very, very serious incidents.
You make some excellent points. Yes,
I just want to add to that about the behaviour of politicians, and I will single out Angela Rayner, who I think behaves in a very, very unprofessional manner occasionally. And I think when you have people in the public eye that almost she did. I think it's fair. Hey, Andrew, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong legally, but I think it's fair to say she said some pretty outrageous stuff about other parties, and it is incitement to violence. And that kind of stuff needs to be caught out and essentially rooted out of politics entirely. It is all very well to disagree, but you do so amicably.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And talking about saying some vile stuff, reports in the press about Andrew Parker, who was a supporter of reform, apparently used a racist slur for Nigel, whilst in Nigel's constituency, and was talking about Rishi Sunak, used a racist slur there. And there's been other problems, haven't there, within the party? What are your views on that, David? Previously, it's been reported that the people who vetted the candidates, they didn't have enough time to do it. And I think Richard Tice is saying he's looking into it. Fill me in on the details.
Well, you know as well as I do what my values and what I stand for. I will not tolerate any homophobia, anti-Semitic abuse, hatred of any type or racism in the party. And if anyone is found to be holding those views, they are out. And we have been very clear about that. Andrew Parker was a volunteer. Now, any political party has lots of volunteers that come along, deliver leaflets, etc. Those volunteers are not screened because they turn up to help the party. It transpires, I don't know if you're aware of this, the story's moved on considerably because Andrew Parker is an actor. Now, I think there are a lot of questions, and I'm being very careful what I say here. There are a lot of questions because Andrew Parker said he once met Nigel Farage. AI has looked at images online. There is a 99.9% certainty between Andrew Parker, the man we know, and this actor who is on acting websites, who appeared in various television programs. He specializes in rough voices. So we are saying, and we are calling it out and saying to Channel 4, there are huge similarities here, and I think you have some questions to answer. And I would also like to know, why are the mainstream media going for Reform UK? And the answer for that is they're terrified of what is happening.
Yeah, well, you do again make an interesting point. I'm glad you come round to the AI and advancing that sort of side. And there was a brilliant program on yesterday, Dispatches, which uncovered a lot of these AI fakes, if you like, and looking at that sort of side and how that might prejudice people. I always say in any election, well, the first casualty in any war is the truth. Well, the same in elections, and AI can contribute to that. But you make a very interesting point. It'd be interesting to see if he is an actor and whether people have been played up on that sort of basis. But one of the criticisms that Keir Starmer says, he said about Nigel Farage, is that his failure to deal with racists in reform shows his weakness as a leader. I'll come to you first on that, Nick, and then back to you, David. Nick.
Every party has these issues every now and again because parties cannot completely vet everybody who's involved in that party, from candidates to volunteers to supporters. It's an impossible ask. But there's certain types of racism, certain types of criticism and hate that's perfectly acceptable in our country at this moment in time. So in Clacton, where Nigel Farage is standing, the Labour candidate was anti-white racist, and everybody found that okay, that he likes to drink white man's tears. So we need to be careful. So David's right. The reason why they're attacking reform at the moment with these slurs and these investigations is because they're terrified of Reform UK at the moment. If they weren't afraid of them, they would be ignoring them and wouldn't even mention them. They're terrified, hence why the attacks are happening. But this is a cross-party problem. You cannot vet everybody who's involved in any political party.
David?
I would agree. And look, we've been very clear that anyone who has behaved in this manner is out immediately. And Nigel actually has been very strong about this. We also had two other people involved in more of a central position within the party that were caught, whether it was a sting operation. They said stuff that is totally unacceptable, and they're out. Look, just going back to the vetting, actually, that's a really interesting point. We paid a lot of money to a company, and we've been really careful and vetting everyone really closely before they become parliamentary candidates. Now, when the Prime Minister called the election, it caught us on the hop slightly. It also caught his own party on the hop, by the way. And so we then had to speed up that process and we did. We got 620 candidates into place. Now, as a result of that, the last few candidates, the vetting wasn't as thorough as it should have been. And of course, that was because of time. And as you know, you have to get the forms into the Electoral Commission on time, and that is a massive job. And congratulations to the entirety of our team for getting those candidates into the Electoral Commission. But obviously, you're going to get some bad apples. And the minute we find bad apples, we throw them away.
Yeah, rotten to the core, some of them. You're absolutely right. We're going to take another break. When we do come back, we're going to talk about Russia and why there's a conspiracy of silence in this election about COVID and how the parties handle it. We'll be back after these messages. Welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, my brilliant team today, Dr. David Bull and Nick Buckley, MBE. All sorts of revelations, all sorts of thoughts on the key policies that will be decided over the next few days. I want to deal, because we talked about how the media are reacting to reform and how the parties are all having a pop at Nigel. And I want to, let's first of all look at Rishi Sunak's claim that Nigel Farage's comment about appeasing Vladimir Putin. Isn't Nigel simply trying to find a pathway to peace, David?
Yeah. And Rishi Sunak is desperate. There he is in his £500 cashmere jumper, slouching and lounging on a train whilst he gives that interview. Look, Nigel, he was asked a question about the geopolitics of what's going on. He pointed to the fact that in 2014, he had said he was deeply nervous about NATO and the EU encroaching on Russia's borders. Now, he said by doing that, and he made this point in the European Parliament in 2014, by doing that, you are going to inflame tensions with Russia. And I think the phrase he used was, you are poking the bear. Well, he has been proved right. Now, and Nigel is no apologist for Putin, because what he has done is absolutely unreservedly horrendous and horrific. And there is a true human cost to this. And so the invasion of Ukraine is completely unjustified. He made a geopolitical comment. And actually, many commentators, including members of parliament, including people who are experienced in defense and in strategic studies, agree with Nigel. But the point is, it's been blown out of all proportion, because what the opposing parties think is that this is our Achilles heel. Well, guess what? On the doorstep, that's not what people are talking about. They're talking about immigration, the economy, the health service, crime, the things that really matter to them. They're not talking about Ukraine.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I mean, there should be the sort of pathway to peace, and basically what we want to find is solutions. And I think the more that we can look at that and understand the context of certain conflicts, the better. What's your take on it, Nick?
I think when we have politicians or the elite telling us that you should not be having these conversations about this particular topic, you cannot be asking questions about this, you cannot be airing your opinion on why this war started, that rings alarm bells with me. We should be able to talk about anything we wish to talk about, because that's the only way you get to the truth. And the fact that people are trying to shut Nigel Farage up over this is a red flag. And let's be honest, we've got Rishi Sunak, who's trying to now claim that he's a patriot and we shouldn't be talking about this. Well, how about if you're a patriot, you secure our borders? We've got Starmer talking about the same thing. Well, if you're a patriot, why don't you wear the poppy when you're speaking to everybody in the country, not only specific people in the country? So these people are hypocrites. I don't know if Nigel Farage is right or wrong on this issue. All I know is he has the right to talk about it and air those opinions.
I think it is putting these things in historical context, and as you say, rather than politicizing it, as you look at it, and there is a pathway to peace, we should explore that. I want to talk about some things that people are not talking about, and it is surprising, not least COVID, and how the parties dealt with COVID during these extraordinary times. People are talking about the overall excess deaths and forcing people to have vaccines and so on and so forth. Why do you think there is this conspiracy of silence, David?
because what happened was shocking. Because the second and third lockdowns were completely unjustified, and I am absolutely livid about it. Elderly people were left alone, frightened and miserable, and they died on their own. And that was because we locked everyone down. We locked children down. They are now having huge problems integrating. They have huge problems with social skills. That is why mental health problems are rocketing and are off the scale. We also talk about the NHS waiting list. Well, that was caused because of the COVID lockdowns. Because what happened was all elective surgery was stopped, all routine appointments were stopped, and people, and I understand why the hospitals reacted in the way they did, but it was predicated on rubbish science. And so we now know that that was completely unnecessary. We were manipulated, actually, as a population. We were terrified. And there's a lot of very interesting articles being written about this, that they terrified the public so much that they were terrified into submission. I want a full public inquiry, a proper inquiry into why they called those lockdowns and what the effects were. When you look at other countries where they didn't lock down, their outcomes were better than ours.
I know, absolutely. And we were looking very recently at Sweden, and they didn't have any lockdowns. They basically, all the children went to school, the restaurants were all open, and they got a much better result. What's your take on it, Nick?
There's two reasons why we're not talking about it. The first reason is the public have moved on. The vast majority of the public have moved on. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. They just have. Another reason why we're not talking about it is because almost every politician, almost every organisation is complicit in this fraud, in these mistakes, in the avoidable deaths of so many people, in the destruction of our economy, in the fact that we're almost bankrupt now. And the people who were responsible, the people who failed to ask the right questions, the people who failed to understand the evidence, want to move on because they know. And we've got people now rewriting history. We have people now saying, I was against the lockdowns. And I'm shouting at the TV going, I remember you for them. I remember the tweets you did telling people all to get vaccinated. You're going to kill your granny. People are rewriting history and we can't allow them to get away with it. So we do need an inquiry, but we need to make sure it's a quick inquiry. 2 years max. We need to get to the truth. And I want some people held accountable. I want some people sacked. I want some people shamed so much they have to resign. And if anything criminal's gone on, which I'm sure it has, I want people locked up. I don't want a 10, 15-year inquiry that comes to the conclusion that lessons have been learned. I'm sick of inquiries that deliver those lessons.
And Nick is absolutely right here, because actually we need to learn lessons now and we need to implement them now, because it's coming again. I'm seeing people in London wearing masks. Tell me why people are wearing masks driving a car when they're the only person in that car. And that's because they're frightened. They've been told to be frightened. Those masks are absolutely ineffective. So we need to learn lessons immediately and instigate them now, because we will see variants of COVID. We will see other viruses emerge. That is the nature of virology. And we need to be prepared.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And those masks don't do anything. So it's complete nonsense. And we're living in fear. And that's the biggest problem. And I always say that history repeats itself because we don't learn the lessons from history. We're living in a very divided age at the moment. There's obviously wars and conflicts in Gaza and so on and so forth, and the terrible situation in Ukraine and various other things as well. What is the solution to the conflicts? Let's look briefly at defence. Nick?
The way we avoid wars is to make sure our enemies are afraid of us. And how do we make them afraid of us? We make sure we have a decent armed forces. So we need to get rid of all the woke nonsense in our armed forces, because that doesn't impress anybody and doesn't make our enemies fearful of us. We need to increase spending, and we need to make sure we've got the best technology. So there needs to be a lot of investment in that. And we need to work with our partners, NATO, America, countries in Europe. That's how we avoid war in the future. Now, there'll be wars we can't avoid. There's a war with China coming, and that's going to happen in our lifetime. How do we avoid that? I'm not sure we can, unless China implodes. China's got lots of internal problems themselves, so only China can stop China invading Taiwan and expanding their empire. But the things we can do now is we need to make sure we have armed forces fit for the 21st century, and we haven't at the moment.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally. The Prime Minister has committed to 2.3% of GDP. I would like to see, or Reform wants to see 2.5% or 3%. I think we should be spending 5% of GDP on defence. We only have 75,000 in the army, 25,000 in the navy. In fact, by 2030, we will have fewer people in our armed forces than in the US Special Operations Forces. And so that is part of the problem. Also, by the way, the recruitment to the army and navy, etc., is run by capita. And there were loads of people, hundreds of thousands of young people signed up to join our armed forces. And because they weren't actually looked at, they left. So these young people gave up because no one actually bothered to come back to them within a year. That is one part of it. The other thing is to make sure that we have food security in this country and to ensure that actually we are buying British and stop relying. And Nick makes a brilliant point about China. We are all complicit. We are clicking on Amazon and buying in cheap stuff from China. And of course, all we're doing is enriching the Chinese economy.
One of the things that Rishi Sunak often says is that a vote for reform guarantees you're going to get Starmer. It will be Starmageddon. Nick, how do we avoid Starmageddon?
We don't avoid it. We embrace it. We need Starmageddon. We need a Labour government. Not because I'm a Labour supporter, but because Labour will take us to rock bottom quicker than the Tories are doing. Tories are taking us decades to get there. Labour's going to do it in 2 years. Once we hit rock bottom, the country will change, we'll get new leaders coming through, and then we can start the long journey of rebuilding. Avoiding Starmageddon and keeping Rishi, they're all heading in the same direction. They're killing us slowly. Let's get to rock bottom first and then build.
David?
They are two sides of the same grubby coin. My response to the Conservative Party is a vote for the Conservatives is a vote for Labour. We are outperforming the Conservatives. We are now the official opposition. I suggest the Conservatives do what we did in the last election where we stood down. The Conservatives should stand down for Reform UK. Then we can form an effective opposition. Indeed, actually, if you add the Conservative and Reform voters, then we are pretty much on a par with Labour. By the way, we also take voters from Labour. So actually, Reform UK is the way to go.
Okay, finally, 30 seconds each, because I know you're both standing in this election. Why should voters choose you over the other candidates? 30 seconds, Nick.
I'm standing in Oldham East and Saddleworth as an independent. And the reason why people should stand for me is because I've got the experience to improve that seat. 20 years reducing crime and antisocial behaviour, 15 years reducing homelessness and rough sleeping. I've advised prime ministers. I've worked for the council. I've worked for all these agencies. I'm not going to concentrate on Parliament because there's no point as an independent. I'll be improving Oldham, East and Saddleworth because it can be done. It can be done quite easily with someone who doesn't care about their political career.
Thank you, David.
I'm standing in West Suffolk. I'm a local boy. I went to school there, grew up there. My family are there. I started a business in Suffolk. Also, you may remember, of course, this was Matt Hancock's seat, the very man I mentioned earlier on. Now, as a doctor, of course, I would like to say that there is no better person to actually sort out the health service. And I think actually what you want in a constituency is someone who cares about the local area and the region, but also because the Reform UK will do well, we believe, in this next election. So actually, I care passionately about Suffolk. It's often ignored. It's a brilliant part of the world. And Andrew, you need to visit.
I'm very much looking forward to that. It has been an absolute delight having you both, Nick Buckley and Dr. David Bull. Good luck with your campaigns and last for 9 days. I will see the rest of you back here, same time, same place tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Did you like that video? I think you did. Hit the bell, give it a big thumbs up, comment, and don't forget, I'm standing for election in Oldham East and Saddleworth. So please share this video, speak to your family and friends if you live in Greater Manchester, and if you live in Oldham East and Saddleworth, make sure you vote for me. Catch you soon.